Hello, everybody. This is Charles Lincoln, back on the Ides of May with, I believe, hang on, let's see if I've got her, VLA. Avila, the beautiful Avila is back with us for a second visit on the Ides of May. And how are you doing, Avila?
I'm doing well. I think this is going to be a very intriguing discussion that a lot of people need to hear. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. I mean, but every time I see you, it's intriguing. You get more beautiful and more wonderful with every day. But anyhow, yeah, I pulled up the Florida House of Representatives, and we have been talking about the utter failure of the alt-right, and now we need to talk about the success of whatever you want to call the people who want to change life in America forever by potentially, I think that it's fair to say the Gospel of John can no longer be taught in Florida. Is that a problem?
So. It is absolutely a problem. For those who don't understand exactly how egregious and abominable this law is, it's likely due to their own religious bias, but honestly, this is absolutely treasonous in every sense of the word in terms of its applications for the First Amendment. So this is quite terrifying.
Well, let's start off by reading it. I have the Florida Representatives, House of Representatives version in front of me. An act relating to anti-Semitism, amending Senate Bill 1000.05 Florida statutes, or no, I guess that's section 1000.05 Florida statutes, prohibiting discrimination in the Florida K through 20. Did you know that it's not K through 12 anymore? It's now K through 20.
K through 20. I am honestly, admittedly, not familiar with that. That's very odd.
Yeah.
Anyway, continue.
K through 20 public education system based on religion, requiring a public K through 20 educational instructor to take into consideration anti-Semitism under certain instances of discrimination, defining the term anti-Semitism, providing construction, amending statutes 1002.20, conforming to changes made by the act, providing an effective date immediately. And it just it adds to this definition: discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, disability, religion is added, or marital status against a student or an employee in the state system of public K through 20 education is prohibited. No person in this state shall, on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, disability, religion, marital status, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or subjected to discrimination under any public K through 20 educational program or activity, or in any employment conditions or practices conducted by public educational institution that receives or benefits from federal or state financial assistance. I hate lawyers. They really write like hell. A public K through 20 educational system must treat discrimination by students or employees or resulting from institutional policies motivated by anti-Semitic intent, in an identical manner to discrimination, motivated by race. For purposes of this section, the term anti-Semitism includes a certain perception of the Jewish people, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jewish people, rhetorical or physical manifestations of anti-Semitism directed towards a person. I guess that's one. Um, uh, um, to a certain perception of Jewish people, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jewish people, rhetorical or physical manifestations of anti-Semitism directed towards a person, his or her property. I don't know how you do that, or towards Jewish community institutions or religious facilities. Examples of anti-Semitism include calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews, often in the name of a radical ideology or extreme view of religion, making mendacious, dehumanizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews as such, or the power of Jews as a collective, especially, but not exclusively, the myth about a world Jewish economic conspiracy or Jews controlling the media, economic, government, or other societal institutions. My hand gestures may be construed as anti-Semitic, I guess. But I'm fascinated by this. Accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group, the state of Israel, or even for acts committed by non-Jews.
Pause for just a moment. Now, allow me to reiterate, did they just admit that you are legally prohibited from talking about actual actions committed by the Jews that are real and tangible, and yet you are not permitted under this law to talk about those things, even if they are factually and historically correct? Because it simply said real or imaginary. So, of course, all actual historical events would fall under that jurisdiction, would they not?
Well, here's what it says: accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group, the state of Israel, or even for acts committed by non-Jews. I think that's actually everything in the world.
Would that include the incident of the USS Liberty, which was committed by the state of Israel? That is a historically proven event. Are we no longer allowed to legally talk about that? Will we face legal repercussions for talking about that? Are they going to cross the Florida line an hour and a half into the state of Georgia to come arrest me for making that criticism?
They might. I mean, I wouldn't want to see. Well, I mean, you'd look good in orange. You'd look good in anything. I don't want to see it happen. I'm just flabbergasted by this. But I haven't finished it, by the way. Accusing Jews as a people or the state of Israel of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. Accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide rather than to the best interests of their own nations. Examples of anti-Semitism related to Israel include demonizing Israel by use of the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism. You mean like this? Images associated with classic anti-Semitism to characterize Israel or Israelis, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, or blaming Israel or all interreligious or for all interreligious or political tensions, applying a double standard to Israel by requiring the behavior of Israel that is not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation, or focusing peace. I'm not misreading that, folks. It really says, or focusing peace or human rights investigations only on Israel. Delegitimizing Israel by denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination and denying Israel the right to exist.
Denying Israel the right to exist. So the all-powerful state of Israel is under an absolute jeopardy if I dare have the audacity to say that I don't like the state of Israel. And I'm not saying that as an opinion, I'm saying theoretically speaking, if I make the statement that I don't like Israel, does that therefore cause the national sovereignty of Israel to be thrown into jeopardy because I express that opinion? No, of course not. But that is, of course, the implication under this law.
Well,
Now,
I mean, it's breathtaking, isn't it? I mean, a bunch of lawyers got together in Tallahassee, and they wrote this. And a majority of them voted in favor of it. As a matter of fact, I think only one person voted against it, and that was a black person. Going back to the last talk we had, um, this is interesting, folks. This is very interesting.
so to reiterate that into simple language, essentially, the state of Florida has criminalized any criticism or statement that could ever be misconstrued as a form of criticism against Israel, against the Jew, whether singular or as a collective group, as a demographic, or in terms of simply the state of Israel. Anything that is said in terms of the Judaic people, in terms of their influence in America, in terms of any historical event pertaining to them, particularly during World War II, anything that is said about them that could ever be interpreted in a less than favorable light is now considerable ground to face legal punishment. Am I comprehending this correctly?
At least in schools. Now, this is not, this is not supposed to apply to street corners, I don't think, but it is so broad that it's breathtaking. It's officially addressed only through K through 20. I still don't know what K through 20 is. Does that mean 8 years after you graduate from the 12th grade, you're still in school? I mean,
I'm honestly not familiar with that term myself.
Last time I checked, 12th grade was graduation from high school when you turn 18. And 20 is, 12 plus 8. So that must mean at the same time that they're saying that, maybe we should lower the voting age to 16, they're saying that effectively people stay children until they're, I think, 26.
I'm not quite certain what the intention is for that particular phrase. I'm not sure why they use that numerical system or whatever that is supposed to mean. But I have a question. So to reiterate a specific part of that bill, does it not state that one cannot discriminate according to religion? Is that not correct?
That's the fundamental amendment to the otherwise semi-uncontroversial parts about discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, disability, or marital status.
All right. So let's take this into a theoretical consideration. Suppose that I enter into a school in the state of Florida and I read the following passage. Narrated Abdullah bin Umar, I heard Allah's apostle Muhammad saying, the Jews will fight with you and you will be given victory over them so that a stone will say, oh Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. If I go into a Florida school and I state, thus narrated Abdullah bin Umar, Allah's apostle said, you Muslims will fight with the Jews till some of them will hide behind stones and the stones will betray them saying, oh Abdullah, slave of Allah, there is a Jew hiding behind me, so kill him. Should I discuss the historical account recorded in the Quran of Muhammad beheading between 600 and 900 Jews in the name of Islam? Is this considered acceptable under this jurisdiction that gives me the religious liberty to quote a religious text that also explicitly calls for the genocide of the Jews?
That's a fascinating question. I mean, I guess the answer is intentionally vague, isn't it? Because if you can't discriminate on the basis of religion, I would think they couldn't stop you from reading the Quran or the Gospel of John.
Absolutely. If on the basis of this law, I under the jurisdiction of this legislation, have the ability to express any religious opinion that I like, including Islam, which of course includes militarized opposition and the explicit command to execute and behead the Jews. But this also goes into direct contradiction of the intention of the law, which is to protect the Jews from anti-Semitism. So what would end up being more relevant in this particular case? Because we also know that Jews are 71% Democrat, according to the poll statistics. So we know that Jews are overwhelmingly liberal and democratic, and therefore they also side with Islam. So would they in turn defend the religious freedom of Islam to express scriptural context that would call for their own genocide?
Well, okay, I think I have the answer in the statute. Examples of anti-Semitism include calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews, often in the name of a radical ideology or extremist view of religion. I mean, that's appalling writing, isn't it? I mean, that's just appalling.
But according to the liberal ideology of religious freedom, this is not considered an act of radicalism because it's merely a quote from the Quran. An act of radicalism, according to the liberal, is one who goes against their own scriptures, one would think, as they so often refer to Christianity, and goes out and commits an act of physical atrocity or terrorism. But this is merely a scripture out of the Quran. So to admit that this is an act of radicalism against the Jews would necessitate that we acknowledge that the Quran itself is an act of radicalism, and that, of course, would be considered Islamophobic in the eyes of the left.
Well, I mean, for purposes of this section, the term anti-Semitism includes a certain perception of the Jewish people, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jewish people, rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism directed towards a person, his property or her property, or towards Jewish community institutions or religious facilities. I mean, I think that sentence covers the Quran.
Certainly, you would think so, but of course, over 70% of Jews would likely disagree with that because they vote Democrat and are considered liberal, which also in turn indicates that they would be the first to accuse one of Islamophobia. So in that sense, it is a blatant contradiction, but I would nevertheless love the opportunity to go into a university in the state of Florida and quote this passage and see, for theoretical and educational purposes, what the consequences would be. Would they in turn choose to violate the religious freedom that they have proven to solidify in legislation, or would they act in the name of the protection of the Judaic population, which is, of course, predominantly liberal, and accuse me of being an anti-Semite and cause me to face legal repercussions for that statement? This is a very interesting hypothesis that I would love to test.
Well, just make sure that Augustus or some other lawyer goes with you as you're doing this, because you might need one. It's scary. The whole thing is scary because it's basically you see. I think what's interesting is it's so broadly worded that almost everything that a Jewish person disagrees with could well be construed as anti-Semitism.
Absolutely, it could. And that's the problem, though, is that a lot of this could be considered to be so subjective and relative that literally anything said and the slightest criticism, irrespective of how objective said criticism is, could be considered to be an act of anti-Semitism. And that in itself is very problematic for the predominantly liberal population of the Jews. However, I also ponder upon the fact that we have statistical data which would indicate a very large bias regarding the perception of Jews within the United States. For example, I wrote quite an exhaustive essay on this topic. And according to the research that I gathered, 83% of Republicans, 72% of independents, and 64% of Democrats all consider Israel to be an invaluable ally, and for that reason, likewise, consider Jews to be an integral part of American society. Now, we all know that Jews make up approximately 2% of the population. This is not an emotional opinion. This is a statistical fact. It is also a statistical fact that Jews are in positions of authority in terms of being CEOs and other individuals, presidents, and other positions like that, of positions of authority, in over 95% of all major news corporations, as well as being extensively influential in areas of technology and things like that as well. And I actually did some research on this, and I found some interesting results, to say the least. the president of ABC, the executive producer of CBS News, the chairman of the NBC Universal News, the CEO of Bloomberg News and Sony Pictures Entertainment, the president of NBC, the creator of LA Weekly, the CCO at Time Inc., and the former executive editor of the Wall Street Journal, the chairman and CEO of the National Enquirer, the publisher of Rolling Stones, the co-founder of TED Talks, the publisher of U.S. News and World Report, as well as the New York Daily News, the former CEO of Paramount Pictures and Fox Inc., the former president of the NBC News Corporation, the chairman of CBS, the president of CBS, the former president of NBC, the former CEO of CBS, the co-CEO of Fox, the president of CNN, and the former CEO and president of NBC are all Jewish. In addition to this, Paramount Pictures, Miramax Films, Warner Brothers, Netflix, DreamWorks, and Amblin Entertainment, Universal Pictures, the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Corporation, Silver Pictures and Dark Castle Entertainment, Disney, 20th Century Pictures, AMC, Sony Pictures, 20th Century Fox, Caravan Pictures, and Walt Disney Studios, Time Warner, Lakeshore Entertainment, Castle Rock Entertainment, Lionsgate Entertainment, HBO, Open Road Films, Showtime, Regency and Summit Entertainment, Orion Pictures, Phoenix Pictures, and TriStar Pictures, as well as the USA Channel, and many others are also run by Jewish individuals. Is it considered an act of hate speech for me to name the statistical data that I just gathered, considering that it is completely devoid of any emotional argument whatsoever?
I think pretty obviously it is. It is a violation of the statute for sure. There's basically no question about that whatsoever. I mean, do you think there is?
In accordance with this law, I think I just demonstrated why this law is absolutely illogical in every way, shape, or form. And two separate arguments, the first being demonstrating the immense hypocrisy that the argument is guilty of when it is universally applied to other religions that actually contradict the well-being and preservation of the Jewish people. And the second, of course, pointing out the statistically high and disproportionate percentage of individuals who are Jewish who are in control of the mainstream media as well as the entertainment industry in America. However, nothing that I claimed, not a single thing that I said was fueled by an emotionally based argument. Nothing that I said was based upon any kind of emotional appeal. Nothing that I said was based upon any logical fallacy. Everything that I said was based upon quotations and citations from the Quran, from a separate text that I simply read, and the other was, of course, merely discussing statistics. So nothing that I stated was in any way, shape, or form based upon an emotional or subjective argument, but everything that I said was objective fact. So the fact that we can discuss objective fact, and yet that can be misconstrued as a subjective act of hate speech, demonstrates in every form or fashion why this law is absolutely and unapologetically absurd in every way, shape, or form.
I guess it's not actually in force yet. I just checked on Westlaw, and it's only called proposed legislation. The currently existing version is still the 2011 version, but it's on the governor's desk, I guess.
But the governor is also going to the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem next month for an entire week to establish and solidify relations with Israel. I think that it's fairly solidified at this point that this is going to pass and it is going to become legislation. And the implications of that are extremely and terrifyingly formidable for the future of the First Amendment in this country. And saying that does not in any way, shape, or form make me an anti-Semitic person. It makes me a logical person who believes in constitutionality and liberty and freedom of speech.
I'm just curious, do you think that there's any benefit to Jewish people in legislation like this? Or is it totally counterproductive? I mean, seriously, it seems to me that it might be totally counterproductive.
Are you asking me in the context of this particular law if I believe there's anything productive?
Yeah.
Absolutely not. This is absolutely egregious in every sense of the word. This is an abomination. This is treasonous and flies in the face of the liberties that we are granted in the First Amendment. And frankly, I have the capacity and the constitutional protection and liberty to express any criticisms that I want to of any particular group, and to pretend that Jews are exempt from that is an absolute lie.
What's the purpose of free speech?
to possess the capacity to express one's opinion. And of course, ideally, that would be an educated opinion. But we see that in certain events like this, legislation can be passed in the name of historical and political ignorance, in the name of political correctness, and in the name of censorship of anything that is considered to be in the least bit controversial. However, we possess and maintain the right, according to constitutionality, to express an opinion that we want to, and that likewise preserves our ability to say what we will, even in the face of opposition that we might face, which is precisely why this is completely antithetical to the American philosophy in general. But of course, many people, especially on the right wing, ironically and tragically, would defend this piece of legislation because they perceive it as a form of religious exemption, which I have shown, I believe, in the first argument I presented as to why that is incompetent, because it can be equally applied to the religion that is the epitome of antagonism towards Judaic existence.
What do you suggest? I mean, what should happen? I mean, what should happen in this context? What should the people of Florida be doing right now?
They need to be having serious discussions with those who are in positions of political influence and power in terms of legislation, and explain to them precisely what I've explained to you and to everyone that's watching right now. This is an absolutely egregious, disgusting, and reprehensible act of treason against the First Amendment, because frankly, it was created to appeal to the sensibilities of 2% of the population. It was created to appeal to the sensibilities of those who cannot bear to hear any opinion that differs from what they themselves believe, which is, again, completely antithetical to everything that the American philosophy represents. I have the right to say something that someone else does not agree with, and I have the right to do so under the protection of the constitutional liberties that I possess under the First Amendment, because you don't have to agree with me. I have the liberty to say something that offends you, and my right to say something that offends you supersedes your right to be offended by it and therefore wanting to silence me because you find it offensive.
One of the interesting provisions of here, I just gotta find it. Nothing in this subsection shall be construed to diminish or infringe upon any right protected under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution or the state constitution. Nothing in this subsection shall be construed to conflict with federal or state discrimination laws. Is it possible? I mean, how do you, it seems like a gymnastic. I mean, you look like a very fit person. Can you do this kind of gymnastics?
I refuse to do this type of gymnastics to appeal to the sensibilities of people that, quite frankly, have not earned the right to silence me. They will never earn the right to silence me, because such a privilege will never be earned under the Constitution. And that's something that, quite frankly, they find to be disgusting and abhorrent. It's something that they cannot tolerate. It's fascinating to me that a demographic that is so predominantly liberal, over 70%, in fact, liberal, that consistently votes Democrat, is so extensively protected by not only the left, but by the right wing also, under the guise of religious influence. Should that not be considered a rather suspicious phenomenon? That's the question I would want to ask.
Suspicious of what? I mean, can we be concrete here? Suspicious of what?
It's incredibly suspicious, as I discussed earlier, that 2% of the population is in control of the vast majority of the media. It's incredibly suspicious that they have, within the context of their religious teachings, a sense of superiority over the Goy or the Gentile or those who are excluded from the religious tradition of Judaism.
You're being sloppy in one way. You are normally very careful, but you're saying 2% of the population controls 100% of the media, or 99% of the media.
Practically.
It is not 2% of the population. It's probably 1/100th of that 2%, actually, isn't it?
Taking into consideration, yes, I suppose I should be more precise in suggesting that it actually is quite less than 2% of the population. However, they claim to represent that entire 2%, which I suppose is why I specify on that particular percentage. But in actuality, you make a fair point, and one that I concede to, and that it's true. It actually is quite less than 2% of the population. We're talking far less than that. So we're talking, as you said, probably less than 1% of the population actively controls the vast majority of the media. What more need to be said than that?
Well, what's there can be done about it? I mean, that's the real question. I mean, is the BBC better than our media? I mean, the BBC is a national crown owned. Everything has a crown on it in the BBC by a woman who's supposedly the fidei defense or the defender of the faith, and yet I saw a video from Trafalgar Square the other day that they were having a gigantic celebration for Ramadan in Trafalgar Square, surrounding Lord Nelson. Okay, I mean, the main connection, I guess, is Trafalgar and Gibraltar are both originally Arabic names, but that is where the Muslim connection to Trafalgar Square ends. I mean, Britain, I guess, I don't know what the percentage of Jewish population in Britain is. Is it less than 2%, or do we have more, or relatively less than Britain's percentage of Jewish population? How did that happen? And why?
That we see reflected, I think, in many different geographical locations. It's not confined to American politics, of course. Regarding your question about the differentiation between European media in contrast to American media, I think that they can sometimes perceive issues, particularly regarding foreign policy, that we do not necessarily perceive. It's very interesting, though, when you observe the historical development of what is now presently referred to as conservatism in this country. There is, of course, the development of what we refer to as neoconservatism, which is, of course, nothing to actually do with conservatism. Neoconservatism was essentially the globalism that was integrated into the so-called conservative movement that was originally instigated by Jewish political interests, Jewish political groups that insisted upon the basis of globalism and interventionism and all of these things, which is in turn evolved into a type of interventionist and war hawk mentality that has infested the Republican Party, which is arguably one of the strongest issues that we have in the Republican Party, is this mentality of interventionism and globalism that has taken the guise of being conservative, but is in actuality completely detached from the conservative philosophy. But that is something that permeates throughout both sides of the political spectrum, and it causes you to ponder upon what creates this similarity and commonality between the left and the right when they appear to be so diametrically opposed in every other area of political doctrine. That's the similarity. It just so happens that they both consider this particular minority to be something of a protected class for different reasons, of course, for the left in the name of political correctness and for the right in the name of religious privilege, so to speak.
But are either of those the real reason?
Well, those are the face reasons, at face value, what they claim the reasons are, the more superficial reasons that we might perceive. But you raise an interesting question as to whether or not those are the legitimate reasons.
I don't think they are. I think that the difference is, why do Charles and Aviele have trouble going online Facebook, they have all these channels, and control over the BBC. It has to do with the financial system, doesn't it?
I would agree.
And what can we do about that?
That's the ultimate question. What can we do about that? Well, right now we can't do anything about that, because right now we're in the process of passing legislation that makes us completely incapable of doing anything about that, because we can't even discuss this as a problem without being labeled under the arguments of emotionally volatile accusations of anti-Semitism and bigotry. We can't have that discussion because we have no place to safely facilitate that discussion and these objective criticisms, because you can't form an objective criticism about the Jews or Judaic influence in the eyes of the American government, apparently. So until something about that drastically changes, until we have a restoration of the constitutional liberty to express an opinion without fear of retribution for said opinion, then we can't facilitate any solutions to these problems. So ultimately, that's essentially what all of this boils down to is, are we capable of facilitating this discussion to point out to people it's not hateful or bigoted to discuss the things that I've discussed here. It's perfectly rational and reasonable to discuss these things that I've discussed. The first two arguments that I presented, as I've said before, did not contain any emotional argument. It didn't contain any inflammatory.
It doesn't say anything about emotions at all.
That's the thing, though. It's all of this is based upon the emotionally volatile and subjective interpretation of things that they don't agree with as being actions of anti-Semitism. Anything that is a criticism of this particular demographic, irrespective of whether those criticisms are legitimate and valid and objective, it doesn't matter because they are all labeled acts of bigotry and hate, which are, of course, emotional accusations. So,
well, listen to the first sentence of paragraph 7 of this. A public K through 20 educational institution must treat discrimination by students or employees or resulting from institutional policies motivated by anti-Semitic intent in an identical manner to discrimination motivated by race. Now, does that mean that if a Jewish student were to flunk, he could basically go in and say, that teacher was blonde and blue-eyed and looked like Hitler Youth. That teacher only flunked me because I was Jewish.
It's essentially an equivalent argument that could be made about any status of a minority in America. And it's for that exact reason in the status of victimization that you will often find that minorities are granted such a large amount of money in terms of scholarships and other educational opportunities and job opportunities solely upon the basis of their race because they are a minority and because they are considered to be a victimized demographic. And upon that basis, the government compensates for that. And I think that you bringing up that point essentially illustrates a very dangerous precedent that they have established with this law. Essentially, anyone that is Jewish could...
institutional policies motivated by anti-Semitic intent.
Define anti-Semitic intent,
And how do you identify the motivation of it? I mean, I'm sorry I interrupted you, but I'm sort of reeling from this whole thing. It is so fascinating because it doesn't sound like America at all. I mean, this sounds very much like the worst abuses of, dare I say, Nazi Germany. The other day I think we were corresponding a little bit about Sophie Scholl, weren't we?
Yes, that's correct. I remember that.
Wasn't Sophie Scholl executed for basically criticizing the German war effort?
That's correct. She was beheaded by the German government for expressing a disagreement with the fact that they were engaged in an act of war. And her philosophy was strongly centered around the idea that we present a civilized and peaceful opposition in terms of the discussion of philosophy as to why we disagree with this war effort. And for that reason, she was beheaded along with her brother Hans.
But if we today were to go into a Florida school, including the University of Florida, where I was actually once offered a job, the job was canceled. I accepted, but that was long time ago. They said the reason was because the lottery didn't bring in enough money. Anyhow, the point I was going to make was, if we were to question Israel's motives for, say, annexing the Golan Heights or as this red ice piece I mentioned earlier talked about, they pointed out how when the Israeli army moved into Ramallah, the very first thing they did when they took over the TV station was start broadcasting 24-hour porn.
What a surprise.
If we discuss those issues, I guess we are in violation of this statute.
Absolutely. I mean, hate speech, as they call it, includes anything that is historically accurate, because history itself is often intrinsically offensive to these people. And upon that basis, you cannot discuss even factual information that they find offensive to their sensibilities.
So what do we do? I mean, I guess, basically we need to have meetings in Florida where we're as far as you can get from schools, right? The idea of there being a campus movement is sort of dead in the water. And I mean, for example, let's talk about something very relevant to the other issue that has been going on the past couple of days. AFP, American Freedom Party, the official sponsor of this show, is running Rick Tyler for president. He has, to use an old racist expression, he does not have a Chinaman's chance of being elected. But we would like to think that running minority candidates has some potential idea seeding purpose, right? I mean, that fair to say, we will not be able to organize AFP rallies on the University of Florida or Florida State campuses, right?
Absolutely not. No feasible probability there at all, I don't think, I'm afraid.
But I mean, isn't that fascinating? And I think that probably includes, really, since it says any institution that receives federal or state funds, almost every private institution receives some federal or state funds, at least in the forms of scholarships or something. And so that means you couldn't organize at Stetson or Florida Atlantic or anywhere else. The entire state of Florida, basically, I mean, I guess that we could still organize, say, on the sponge docks at Tarpon Springs. Maybe that's far enough from a school. People might get a little bit confused, but it's. I mean, why is this? Okay, let's change the whole question for a minute. Why is this happening right now?
Because it's essentially an instrument used to perpetuate a totalitarian agenda and effectively castrate the entire First Amendment in every capacity that American citizens have to express an opinion that others simply don't agree with. And of course, Jews being, according to the simple explanation, let me put it that way. According to the simple explanation, and just taking into account the fact that Jews are predominantly liberal and Democrat, we could assume, according to that statistic, that for that reason, them being a predominant demographic on the left, of course, is going to utilize that in an effort to silence those who express an opinion that they disagree with, and therefore are going to essentially destroy any ability to criticize those on the left, just as they have with many other demographics. Just as you are accused of Islamophobia if you criticize Islam, or transphobia if you discuss transgender people, or so on and so forth. But it seems that the steps regarding silencing those who criticize the Jewish population is taken an even further step into that direction with actually passing legislation to criminalize those on campuses who express an opinion, which is indicative of one thing that I feel is blatantly obvious at this point, and that is college campuses are the locations in which we see the greatest amount of indoctrination in the entire country. this is how they perpetuate the entire leftist agenda, because you begin to indoctrinate students at quite a young age. And by the time they've graduated high school and entered college, they've already been successfully indoctrinated into believing that these absurd and extremist ideas that they have become quite familiar with, in particular communism and the destruction of constitutionality and freedom of speech, they believe that these things are normalities at that point, after having been indoctrinated into the system for several years. So this is merely a confirmation of that fact, and anyone who would ever deny that is quite historically ignorant and voluntarily ignorant in terms of modern events as well. So this is essentially just proving what we already know, and that is that college and school campuses are where all of these things occur. We thought initially that it was primarily in college campuses, but we see that it's not. It's also cultivated in even grammar schools, beginning at quite a young age and developing through middle school, through high school, and then into college. These same ideas are being perpetuated throughout the school system. And it's quite a shame that what once was considered to be an educational system is now nothing more than a system of indoctrination.
I guess one of the disturbing things to me is I'm not sure from a historical perspective that public education was ever anything but indoctrination.
To an extent, I agree. To an extent, I don't necessarily find that very controversial. I mean, I'm pretty much in agreement with that point, that I think that federal education in general is quite an atrocity. So I'm inclined to agree.
It's just, well, I mean, the original point of public schools, which were first instituted in Prussia, I believe, was to prepare Prussian citizens to be good soldiers, good citizens of a militaristic society. And it was resisted all over America. People didn't want public education, and yet they were told it was the best thing in the world. It was really the first form of welfare ever. And it's just amazing, because if this is adopted and if this somehow survives in Florida, the American dreams that you and I share are really pretty much dead, aren't they?
Essentially, I mean, at that point, it's pretty inevitable that either of us or both of us end up in some prison or something similar, in which we're...
They'll call it a re-education camp, I think.
something
or possibly a mental hospital.
That, yes.
Yes. Possibly a mental hospital.
Right. Will be legally criminalized for having an opinion that is dare have the audacity to disagree with them, an opinion that they find contrary to the truth of political correctness. So,
an interesting question. I think I've asked you about Gilad Atzmon before. Have you ever read any of Gilad Atzmon's work?
I don't believe so, no.
Too bad. Because I was going to ask you, and maybe we can pick this up at some point, if Gilad Atzmon is now, if suggesting one read Gilad Atzmon's books, like The Wandering Who, for example, is going to be an act of anti-Semitism. Gilad Atzmon is born in Israel. His specialist is the philosophy of identity, of cultural identity, and he shares some of these perceptions of Jewish people which may be expressed as hatred towards Jewish people, rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism directed towards a person, his or her property, or towards Jewish community institutions or religious facilities. And if Gilad, I mean, in other words, this is going to impact a lot on Jewish freedom too. So this is kind of related to, Jews cannot criticize the state of Israel. Jewish Floridians who think that the confiscation of Palestinian land is going too far.
Right.
Never mind those who think that Israel is a terrorist state, but there are Jewish people who believe that Israel is in the wrong, and this is going to turn Jews into anti-Semites.
Absolutely. It's a very similar phenomenon to what we see happening to African Americans in this country who do not agree with the agenda of the Democratic Party. It's a very similar phenomenon that we see in which, as I mentioned earlier, take, for example, conservative activist Candace Owens. She's Black, and yet she's referred to in the most filthy and degrading of terms in terms of racial insults by Antifa when she does not agree with their communist agenda. It's very ironic to see.
Do you know Cynthia McKinney?
I don't believe so, no.
Okay, she's from your state. She's Georgia, former Georgia congressman. I believe Cynthia McKinney is the one who she's taken stands against the IRS and against the Zionist lobby in the U.S. And I just had this image of Cynthia McKinney being beheaded like Sophia Scholl under this statute. And that's the kind of consequence. I mean, she's Black. Cynthia McKinney is Black. And so I'm just wondering, rhetorically, we need to bring issues like that up to the forefront. I mean, that's something we can do, because this kind of, I mean, certainly, what's his name, the former Ohio congressman, names are failing me right now. The Italian name, real popular guy with alt-rightists. Oh, I can't. What's wrong with me? Anyhow, there was a congressman who died several years ago, who I knew the guy. This is really embarrassing. He criticized the Israeli lobby. He died under very strange circumstances. You have no idea who I'm talking about?
I don't believe so, admittedly. I don't. It doesn't ring a bell for me.
I'll pull this up in a second, but anyhow, he's definitely, even talking about him, you would run the risk of Trafficant, James Trafficant, died September 27, 2014. Yes. James Anthony Trafficant. You know, you can't even, you'd run the risk, if you discussed his contributions, you'd be running the risk of falling under the aegis of this law. And so I just wonder, I mean, what is the first step here? I mean, I assume that people will file suit to prevent the enforcement of this law. I imagine that there are people planning on doing that. Governor Scott, as you said, has a scheduled trip to Israel, and he's expected to sign this into law at that point. Do we live in a world whose center is Jerusalem?
Under present conditions, it would seem so, at least in the United States, when it comes to areas like Florida that are openly endorsing this legislation that would essentially destroy any ability to express an opinion that is considered to be not complicit with the politically correct perception of Israel, which is quite terrifying, to be quite honest.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, I'm skipping a Ramadan dinner at my traditional Episcopal church founded by Leonidas Polk tonight. I am consciously avoiding uh, celebrating Ramadan with Episcopalians. I mean, and during Lent, just ended a couple of weeks ago with Easter, uh, the new rector of our church, the one who unfriended me on Facebook because he didn't want to be associated with these podcasts, uh, he I think he did this specially for me. Actually, he had his every Lent. You usually have a lecture series in church, and his lecture series for Lent was the Jewishness of Jesus. Uh, it happened that it was right after he and I had these big arguments in January, February, and so he might have been planning it in advance, but I felt like it was kind of aimed at me. And the Jewishness of Jesus, and that ended in a Seder dinner on the Wednesday before Easter, uh, a Passover Seder dinner at the church. And I mean, okay, this goes to the fundamental awile, the pagan identity. Why is it that the Christian church has fallen so heavily into the spell of everyone who wants to destroy Christianity? And I mean, what can pagans do about it? Because you all basically have no organized religion at all, right? I mean, there are no major temples that you can take the place uh, of churches in our society, are there?
No, there's not. And for some, I mean, a lot of people would consider that to be something of a liability, but it in fact is quite a strength in a world in which we are ruled by centralized powers. Why? Because it emphasizes the nature and the importance of the integral component of paganism that is self-sufficiency, something that I feel that Christianity currently lacks in its modern form due to the nature of the postmodern church. Look, for example, at the Catholic Church. It's one of the most corrupt institutions on the face of the planet currently. And of course, a lot of people have disagreements with Catholicism and other branches of Christianity, and that's absolutely warranted. However, you know that my own criticisms of Christianity come from a fundamental disagreement with the nature of Christianity in terms of some of its relations to Judaism. However, it's also very interesting because if you read the New Testament in particular, it emphasizes the contrary nature, and that's to quote the Apostle Paul, who calls the Jews contrary to all men. In fact, to quote him, he refers to the Jews as people who both killed the Lord Jesus and their own prophets and have persecuted us, and they please not God and are contrary to all men, according to 1 Thessalonians 2:15. This is blatantly within the New Testament, and anyone who is not familiar with this hasn't read it. But that point aside, I have my own disagreements with Christianity, but I can respect some of the principles of it. I'm not one of those individuals who feels the need to behave in a condescending manner towards Christians. I believe in a reciprocal respect there. And I absolutely will defend the right of Christianity to express its opinions and beliefs when it comes to, the same enemies that we face, particularly regarding to other Abrahamic religions that I feel are immediate and formidable threats in the face of Western civilization. So, it's interesting because paganism has never relied upon any centralized authority. We've never relied upon any central scripture or church. It is very much contingent upon the nature of being self-sufficient and independent. It is contingent upon your personal relationship with the gods, which is something that I think we're desperately needing in the modern day because we need to have that self-sufficiency. And even for Christians, I encourage my friends that are Christian to often consider this point, that to rely upon the centralized authority of the church is a point of detriment because the churches are so corrupt, because they are filled with individuals who insist upon universalism, who insist upon globalism, who insist upon a universal tolerance. Those things I fundamentally disagree with. So I think that it is a strength to have those tenets of self-sufficiency and independence, which I'm sure you're aware. being involved in your interest in archaeology and all of those different things as well, that the nature of paganism in the pre-Christian world of antiquity is largely contingent upon agrarian cults, primarily revolving around the cult of Demeter and Dionysos as well. The interesting things about those and about the esoteric mysteries of Hellenismos was the fact that a lot of them were very private and were centered around the agrarian cults that were very localized in nature. I recall reading a quote regarding paganism that said that essentially the reason that paganism fell was that it was replaced by a universalist form of Christianity, whereas the pagans never emphasized universalism because that is not within the tenets of our philosophy. Our philosophy is instead based upon localized worship of our gods, and we didn't ever have the perception that our gods are meant to be the gods of all people, in contrast to what the Bible teaches in terms of the Christian God being applicable to all men. We don't have that perception of our God in particular. It is rather the face of our gods or the face of our people and our demographic, and that is our personal religion that we practice that is representative of our ethnic group, of our demographic. And that's why, personally, it really appeals to me. And that's why I believe that there is a resurgence of paganism in the modern day. In fact, many people that I've talked to in our branch of political discourse as well have expressed a recent interest in paganism for that reason, because there is something localized, there is something self-sufficient, there is something independent in paganism that many people find very appealing for that reason. So that's essentially a little bit of my perspective on that.
Well, it's just amazing because a counter question is it possible that, as the world has grown so much bigger or smaller, depending on that every individual's world has grown bigger as the world has grown smaller. I mean, you and I can think about Madagascar and the Indian Ocean and the South Pacific today in ways that our ancestors, even 100 and 150 years ago certainly could not. We understand the problems of ecological degradation of the habitat of lemurs in Madagascar. It may not affect us immediately, but we can sort of understand how we're all in this together, and burning down the rainforest that the lemurs live in may have consequences for the oxygen supply all around the world. So, I mean, religion has always been the quest for understanding, right? I mean, would you agree with that? And universality of religion has a certain intellectual appeal because there are sort of universal truths. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I would agree to some degree, yes.
Well, I mean, even to the point that we say everyone has the right to self-determination. Either that is a universal truth or it's not. Either Jews and Anglo-Saxons have the right to define themselves and exist, or they don't. If it's just the law of the jungle, then if that's the only universal truth, then we have no real business criticizing the Jews for enacting things like, this bill that's been passed in Florida. And the only real question is, why are we letting it happen when at most they constitute 2% of the population? And in reality, they probably don't even represent, the people who are pushing for this sort of thing don't really even represent that 2% wholly. What do we do? I mean, because either there is truth that applies to everybody, or there's not. And if there's no truth that applies to anybody, and it's only competition, then is civilization in any sense possible?
So it's a very interesting question that you raised, and I'm really glad that you brought it up because it actually kind of delves into a little bit of the more complex side of my own personal philosophy, and that is, first and foremost, in the discussion of universal truths, we can argue that there are specific universal truths. But if we argue, for example, that the idea of self-determination is a universal truth, that's a passive universal truth. That's not some sort of theocratic law that you're attempting to oppose or impose upon the rest of the population in the world. That's not like a militarized belief that you say you have to believe this way. That's an opportunity for the liberty to express your personal autonomy and express your freedom to self-determination in the way that you want. So that's not exactly, a militarized or arguably antagonistic religious belief that you're forced to discuss or acknowledge. That's, something that we consider to be.
But we're faced with now the situation where it may take a military revolution in Florida to prevent this from becoming the norm. And I mean, there are so many examples of suppression of freedom of speech. As you said, it's relating to the basis of sex, which has become like this all-consuming obsession for the world. The basis of sex, the definition of gender, transgender, all that. It's just, we are, in fact, under criminal threat already for things related to that, right? And so, I mean,
well, if we're discussing the correlation between that and the right to self-determination, I said I believe in the right to self-determination, not the right for your self-determination to impede upon my right to self-determination, which is precisely what is happening when you're attempting to.
Who protects it if not armed force? I mean, I
agree, and I can see to that point, absolutely. But I do think that it may eventually reach that point because the act itself of legislating the ability to say something or not to say something because it offends one particular demographic sensibilities is utterly preposterous and treasonous in every sense of the word. So could we reach that point? Absolutely, if nothing is done to stop this. And at the current moment, we know that we can't even facilitate this discussion without facing antagonism. I mean, the left has already proved that they are more than enthusiastically willing to utilize violence against us for expressing an opinion that they disagree with. I saw recently a member of Antifa openly walked up to a woman and punched her in the face for disagreeing on the topic of abortion. This is something that is becoming increasingly frequent in political discourse because the left is, of course, facilitating acts of domestic terrorism and excusing it under the guise of social justice. So we've already reached that point. And it will be the day when they attack the wrong group of individuals, the wrong group of patriotic Americans and constitutionalists, and they have a gun pulled on them and someone gets sent to the morgue, that we will be facilitating this larger discussion and say, hey, this is about to have some very real, very tangible physical consequences as a result of this totalitarian legislation that is being enforced on the American people. So, it's not something that we look forward to with bated breath exactly, but it's one of those circumstances where you certainly you prepare for the worst, but hope for the best, so to speak.
Well, what do you think the first thing we should do to prepare is?
It's difficult to prepare given the consideration of what we could potentially face here, which is an absolute physical confrontation against these people. It's not something that we desire. We don't desire to go to these events and be physically assaulted for having a different opinion and having the audacity to express a right that is constitutionally guaranteed. But we also take into consideration the fact that we know that we have no constitutional rights if we do not possess the capacity to defend them. And unfortunately, that often comes to situations of physical confrontation. So it's one of those situations where we take into consideration just what might occur as a result of the implications of these policies. The day that I am put in jail for expressing an opinion is the day that we realize we're going to have to make it clear that I'm not going to voluntarily go to jail for expressing an opinion. I'm not going to voluntarily be reprimanded for saying something just because you don't like it. And it's going to come to that point where they're going to attempt to arrest an American citizen for expressing an opinion, and someone along the way is going to say, no, you're not, because I haven't done anything wrong. I have not done anything immoral. I have not breached anyone else's capacity to express their constitutionally protected right to free speech. And it's going to come to a point where we could very well face some sort of physical confrontation with these people. So I think it's very much a mental preparation that things could eventually reach that point. And you come face to face with your convictions and you inquire to yourself as to what you're willing to do for the sake of the values that you claim to adhere to. What are you willing to go to defend your constitutional rights? If someone attempts to arrest you, are you going to resist that? Are you going to go along with that? Or are you going to simply suffice to sit in prison for the next 20 years because you dare say that you have a criticism about Israel? Or are we going to come to that point? So I think that a lot of this is very much contingent upon a mental preparation for what we might deal with. But in the meantime, discussing this like we're doing right now is very important, because raising awareness to this issue and discussing it in a way that is very objective, like I started out in the beginning of this discussion, is very important. And showing people, hey, you can discuss this issue objectively. You can discuss this issue without any emotional connotation and point out the hypocrisies of this. Then I think that it will raise awareness to this issue. So that's my more idealistic side. Definitely hoping for that. But like I said, it's very much a state of mental preparation for what we might have to deal with in the future as a result of these totalitarian policies.
Well, we've been talking for a while, and I'm not sure what we can say that will resolve anything tonight. I have one very, very personal question for you, though. Show me your glass. Okay. I think we have an evidence of
very
mass
similar
production.
Oh, I think this is actually the exact same glass. I'm pretty sure.
Yes, I think it is.
That's cool.
Hilarious. Mass production in America. And who controls it? Who controls mass production in America? Who is distributing the goods of the land? And where is this made? I don't even know. I mean, it'd be terrible if this was made in China, wouldn't it? Absolutely horrendous. But anyhow, Awile, it has been a pleasure talking to you. And we're going to have to get together soon again, because we didn't really discuss the American Freedom Party, or what, your opinion of this group of old men that I'm part of is, we're almost a collection of dead white males. It's kind of interesting. There's soon to be dead white males, I guess, is more to the point. And, people like you are the jewels and the treasures of the world. And I want you to be the face of the American Freedom Party, not me, not Rick Tyler, certainly not Tulsi Gabbard.
I would hope not.
And we need to reconvene and talk about that sometime soon. But there are other things that I've got to do before the day ends, and there might be other things you've got to do before the day ends too. So anyhow, I'm going to close us off for tonight. This is Charles Lincoln from New Orleans. And Avili, where are you? Where are you? Are you in Georgia? Can you?
Yes, I'm in Southwest Georgia.
Near Plains?
I'll prefer to leave it intentionally vague. Just, for the sake of the Antifa that are always stalking my videos, I'll just leave it in Southwest Georgia.
But, the interesting thing is, up to a point where we have to be ready for those confrontations, and we need to challenge them, don't we?
There will come a day where we do. We will definitely be there to present that challenge to them, not only ideologically, but physically if need be, because like I said, there will definitely come a day where they will attempt to arrest the wrong person or the wrong group of people, or, something like that. And it's only inevitable that this will be an eventual consequence of this type of legislation. So
And then where will the lines be drawn in the sand? Where will the states be when there are no states to defend us? I'm not sure of any of. Really happy Ides of May. Good night. And you just look especially beautiful and ravishing tonight. I have to say, you are just a pleasure to watch. And so, good night, and we will talk soon. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night from New Orleans.